Today we will be discussing about one of the most subversive and depraved thinkers in all of human history, the Marquis de Sade, father of sadism, and a man who explored the darkest crevices of human sexuality and sensual pleasure. Well, we know the word sadism, and do you know where it came from? I'll give you a hint. It came from this man's life, his anecdotal works, and obviously from his writings. His name is Marquis de Sade, Sade, which is actually the prefix for sadism or sadist. But do not be deceived by this fellow's innocent looks. He is a very depraved man, yet a very great thinker in my view. The Marquis de Sade was born in the Hotel du Conde in France, and he was lucky to be born over there. The Hotel du Conde was only used by the royal families, and only the great kings and rulers would be born there. His father belonged to the line of the family of Sade, which could trace their lineages back to Emperor Charlemagne, and his mother belonged to the Conde family. That's why he was born into the Hotel du Conde and was raised alongside and was playmate of King Louis. And if you consider the relationship with his mother and his mother's relationship to the Conde family, which is actually, and the Condes themselves were relations to the House of Bourbon, the ruling house of France. So Marquis de Sade and the king were basically relatives or distant relatives. But he belonged to such an aristocratic family, belonged to such great men. He himself would have been, as everyone would have gotten at that time, or any aristocrat, a proper military and aristocratic education. But then why is this fellow so infamous for his philosophical or sometimes pornographical works? The reason being the way he lived his life. Marquis de Sade was a famous sadist. He was a libertine. And you know what's the meaning of libertine? Libertines are those who do not abide by social norms and conventions and who satisfy their sexual desires. They experiment on various types of sexuality. It can be homosexuality, heterosexuality, voyeurism. They often do, and often leads to what you say, flagellation, and all these other forms of sexual activity. But that is what made Marquis de Sade the most infamous of all thinkers because he lived his life according to his libertine principles, sexually, what do you say, open and abrasive, but also he wrote about it. And for anyone watching this video, I'm not endorsing the Marquis' lifestyle or any of the scandals, but I'm endorsing or I'm kind of supporting his literary career and his work because his work should not be disregarded. Rather, it should be a testament to the Enlightenment, which many people even to this day call Marquis de Sade the child of the Enlightenment. Well, talking about the House of Bourbon, as mentioned, the Marquis de Sade was a distant relative of the King of France and was very close to the royal family. But he was thrown out of the Hotel du Conde and he was asked to leave during when he and the king, being children or like playmates, he struck the royal child with his hand. Although this could be, I mean, in nowadays, if you just hit your friend, you would apologize. But in those days, striking a royal child was a crime. And they were asked to leave the Hotel du Conde. Finally, after many years, Marquis de Sade lived in his favorite castle. He lived in his favorite castle. Okay, the castle de Coste. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. That explains his stuttering. But he this was his favorite castle. And over here is where the Marquis de Sade conducted many of his sexual orgies, where multiple times he was involved in various scandals. One scandal being where he took a prostitute, locked her behind doors, and forced her to read irreligious poetry. Then it seems he used bodily fluids in the holy chalice and then forced her to trample on on the cross, reciting irreligious poetry. It was also said that the Marquis would also, besides this, he would also ask some of the prostitutes to beat him or flagellate him. Although this was considered widely subversive even to this day. For libertines such as Marquis de Sade, they had a deeper meaning. Although even I also do not endorse such behavior, considering it highly improper. But again, as mentioned before, I'm not here to endorse his life, but rather his literary works. But again, we should not forget that despite his infamous life and his infamy, the Marquis de Sade was truly the child of the Enlightenment. He was up to date with the modern scientific and philosophical developments, and he was also alive during the transition of power from the French monarchy to the French Revolution and finally to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. We must understand that the Marquis de Sade was imprisoned in the Bastille for many of his subversive acts during the revolution. It was said that he would go into the prison cell and yell out to the revolutionaries, saying that the guards were beating up the prisoners so that they could storm the Bastille and release all the prisoners. But but unfortunately, the Marquis de Sade was removed from prison and was transferred to another place. We must also remember that the Marquis wrote many of his great works, such as The Dialogue Between a Priest and a Dying Man, or Juliet, Justine, and 120 Days of Sodom, along with many other letters and aphorisms in his time in prison. It was said he hid all of those notes inside the prison wall, and when the Bastille was stormed, he thought all his work was lost. But luckily for him, it survived. As mentioned, he lived during the time of the French Revolution, and it was because of the revolution that he escaped. But you might be wondering, this fellow was the relative of the king. He was a close member of the House of Bourbon, an aristocrat in his own right. How did he survive the mob of France? The answer being that despite being close relatives to the king, he was not favored by him. Ironically, it was the king only who got him sent to prison, and he was made to stay there under royal orders. So the revolutionaries were sympathetic to the Marquis because it was the king who put him in prison, nobody else, and he was free and he was spared. But as mentioned, the Marquis de Sade was big into Enlightenment science. He knew about the scientific discoveries, and if you read all of his books, especially A Dialogue Between a Priest and a Dying Man and Philosophy in the Bedroom, you will see that all the characters they justify their libertine or sexual claims through biological and physics. Where I'll give you an example. Okay, um, it was said in Philosophy in the Bedroom, one of the characters mentioned that nature has designed humans in a biological fashion to satisfy their desires. And she called the reproductive organs as the altar of the goddess Venus. And it was necessary, as she said, to satisfy these desires. Although these desires also extended not only to, what do you say, to mainly heterosexuality, but included other forms of sexual activities and orgies as well. So we must be careful in our reading of Marquis de Sade and his works. But we must not deny his clever use of science, his wit, and his wisdom in his criticism of religion and of the social conventions in which he was born into. Well, I think we have spoken enough of the Marquis. So I think I will be spending the rest of the video discussing, or at least noting some important points about his book, A Dialogue Between a Priest and a Dying Man. If you read the starting of the book, okay, it's a very short book. The one which I have read, or the version which I read, contained approximately, I think, 274 pages, excluding the preface and the dedication. If you if you read this work, you will find out that the Marquis de Sade had started the dialogue. Okay, so he has started the book by talking about the priest, a holy man, who has come to meet a dying man, although his name has not been mentioned throughout the book. The name of the dying man is basically the dying man. But if you read the book, the dying man is a libertine, like the Sade, and the priest is a Christian. Often we notice, if you read normal fables, we read that someone is wrong, or they made mistakes, or they're not doing the right thing, they meet somebody wise, or they have an experience which makes them a good person. But and Marquis de Sade uses the same technique, but in the opposite manner, where people who follow Christian virtues, such as in this case the priest, or in the case of what do you say, philosophy in the bedroom, a girl called Eugene, or in Justine, a girl Justine, all of them, they are, let's say, virtuous. They follow virtue, they follow social norms, religious norms. But Marquis de Sade says that over the course of the book, these people, they learn the truth of nature, the truth of sexual gratification, how important it is, how it is important to follow your desires, to satisfy your desires like a libertine, and how, and Marquis de Sade flips it on his head. He claims that the virtues that we have been taught in all of these cultures are false, and that we should truly look after our carnal desires and needs, which has been emphasized throughout all his work. If you read the starting of the book, the priest will ask the dying man, "Is there anything that he has Is there any sin he has committed that he repents?" And the dying man says, I quote, "I told you that I repented. I heard you," the priest says. The dying man says, "Yes," without understanding me. And the priest asks, "What do you mean?" And this is the starting die, and this is the first piece of philosophical wisdom in the second page of the book, where you can get an insight into Marquis de Sade's radical philosophy. I quote, "Just this, created by nature with the keenest taste, with every strong passion, placed in this world solely to yield them and to satisfy them. These consequences of my creation being no more than a necessity arising from the first design of nature, or if you prefer, the essential corollaries of her plans for me, everything being in accordance with her law. I repent only for not having sufficiently recognized all her powers. My sole remorse only to the modest use I made of faculties, criminal according to you, quite straightforward according to me, which she has given me for her service. I sometimes resisted her. I repent for this. Blinded by the absurdities of your doctrine, I fought with their help against all the violence of the desires I had received. Much more divine inspiration, and this I repent for. I have gathered only flowers. I could have made a rich harvest of fruits. What this is the premise of Marquis de Sade's grand philosophy. The Marquis believes that nature has created us with sexual desires, or not just sexual desires, but desires at large, and that our duty, and it is man's nature that we have to follow Mother Nature's creation, that we have to satisfy our desires. So Marquis de Sade will say that if you fall in love with a girl and you want to sexually satisfy yourself, even if it's against her wishes, you should do it. If a woman falls in love with another person and if it's against, and if she wants to satisfy her desires, however she wants, if she falls in love with a man or a woman or anybody, in fact, she has to satisfy her desires, because that desire, those things are the dictates and ordains of nature, and that we have to follow him. This is the libertine philosophy of Marquis de Sade, satisfying your sexual desires and your carnal pleasures. But how does this relate to what I said about characters being bad and then becoming good? I'll give you an example. In philosophy in the bedroom and a dialogue between a priest and a dying man, the girl Eugene in the second book and the priest in this dialogue, both of them are virtuous. But the so called good characters in Marquis de Sade's book are libertines who are sexually active, who believe that things such as greed, arrogance, lust, and all are not sins but virtues, and who believe in satisfying their carnal desires and their sexual desires in however way possible. They purify these virtuous Christian, sometimes socially and legally abiding citizens into radical, sexually free, what is a hedonistic, shameless libertines. So these pure souls, like the priest, being a virtuous man at the end, becomes, what do you say, an irreligious libertine. But for Marquis de Sade, that's good, because the priest was blinded. He got to know true knowledge thanks to the libertine, and he himself became a libertine. So instead of good characters becoming bad, or instead of bad characters becoming good, good characters become bad in this. But in Marquis de Sade's view, even the good characters become bad. They become bad is not because it's bad, it's because it's good for themselves. They're following their true nature. And this is the premise for most of his philosophy. And he gives further more arguments. He denies the existence of God, claiming that nature has created everything with our desires and our carnal pleasures. So why do we need a God? And then later he himself claims that nature does not require God, that no other God exists except for nature. I'll in this quote, uh, the priest says, who can understand the immense and infinite plans of God? For man who can understand everything we see. Okay, that's what the priest says. Okay, who can understand God's plans? But the dying man has a counter to it. He who simplifies matter, my friends, who above all, who does not multiply causes to confuse effects. What need do you have for second difficulties when you can't explain the first one? Seeing that it is possible for nature on her own to have done what you have attributed to your God. So basically, he's saying that whatever, any God, in fact, in many of the cultures that Marquis de Sade saw, he doesn't believe in those gods, but he believes that nature is a true God, is the only thing that exists and that we must follow. Okay, later, the dying man again comes with another interesting, quite provocative counter. It is therefore possible that that it should be necessary. Things without wisdom, possible in consequence that everything rises from the first cause. There being either reason or wisdom in this, the first cause. The priest will ask, what are you trying to get at? To prove that, then the dying man explains. To prove to you that everything can be as it is, as you see it to be, without any wise and reasonable cause guiding it, and that the natural effect must have a natural cause, without any need to anti natural causes for them, such as your God, who I already told you himself needs an explanation without being able to be provided one. And in consequence, seeing your God is no good for anything, it is utterly useless, which in every indication, whatever useless is none, and that everything which is null is non existent. For me to be convinced that your God is a chimera, and no other argument than that to provide for me the conviction of his uselessness. So, what is Marquis de Sade trying to get at here? 2 points I can understand by this paragraph. The first point being that, again, as mentioned time and again, all our desires, whatever we feel right now, let's just say you go and see a very beautiful girl, and let's just say you get sexually attracted. The Marquis says you might think, it might be lustful, it might be shameful, but the Marquis de Sade says it's not, because these desires are these desires are natural and are put into by nature. But we must expand on this furthermore, that Marquis de Sade does not only talk about basic teenage or middle age where you say love, but he also talks about all sorts of sexuality, and some even more radical that even at modern standards it's not acceptable. But he says acting on them is not a crime, but rather it is essential. And the second argument, and if you expand on this, he says it's not only essential, it is natural and it is required of us as humans to act on these desires. The second argument he gives is that nature does not need an explanation to rule over us. She does not need an explanation. She is there. She is naturally, scientifically proven. While God on the other hand, he needs an explanation, and such explanations, Marquis de Sade tells, is useless. And if it's useless, he explains as null. And if it's null, it's non existent. So not only does he claim that God is useless, but from that argument he proceeds to prove that God is useless, is non existent. So we have made four important points from so far. First being the reverse, how Marquis de Sade reversed the idea of fables. Instead of bad characters becoming good, good characters become bad. But in the Marquis' view, that's not really bad, but it's a good process because they're getting towards the truth by becoming bad. And another point is how nature naturally wants us to have, nature has instilled organically into us some desires, mostly sexual desires in the Marquis' case, which we can act on any cost. And that acting on them is not a crime. And the last but not the least, his argument against God, which you have just explained. But there's one last consequence. There's not consequence. Sorry. There is one last argument I would want to make. And this again, I'm coming back to one more paragraph on this book. Nothing amuses me more than the evidence of the extremes to which men have taken to fanaticism and idiocy in these areas. These type of such monstrous deviations that are for me, the sight of them, the horrible is always interesting. Answer freely, above, banish egoism. If I were weak enough to let myself be taken by your ridiculous doctrines based on fabulous existence of on beings who make religion necessary, under the former who advise me to offer worship, would me to adopt the fantasies of Confucius rather than the absurdities of Brahma. Should I adore the great serpent of the Negroes and the stars of Provunion and the lost horse of Moses, which of sex of Mammoth, you have me go. Of the heresies of Christians, would be preferable to you. Take care with your reply. Well, what is he explaining here? Well, he's claiming, more or less, at least in my perspective, that all of the holy men, such as Confucians, Christians, Moses, Lord's host of Moses, Peruvians, and Mammoths, are all heretical. If you guys know about the Salem witch trials or any other executions, people who were non-believers were executed by the church for being heretical. But the marquis flips that on his head. As mentioned with the fable concept, he flips this on its head by saying, those who do not follow the rules of nature or do not follow her laws are heretical and their words are heresy. And in his view, uh, the monotheistic or the Judeo-Christian, what do you say, belief of what do you say, charity, avoiding lust, avoiding wrath, avoiding your carnal desires which can actually defile your soul, avoiding, let's say, greed or vanity. In the Marquis' view, these are all heresies against nature because the Marquis believes that we have sexual desires or we act on them because it is naturally put into us by nature. We have greed and vanity because it is part of our natural instincts. It is part of who we are, created by nature's grand plan. So for him, he is not what do you say, the traitor, or he is not the heretic, but rather it's the church, the priests, and the Christians, or any other people following social conventions are heretical or the heretics against nature. And this is another concept of how the Marquis flips concepts on its head. Okay, and coming back, as the dialogue ends, I only mentioned five of the points I wanted to explain. But as the dialogue ends, the dying man is at its end, and he says, and he makes a and and he says, give up the ideas of the next world. There is no such thing. But don't give up the pleasure of being happy and of making others so. It is the only way which nature offers you to repeat and prolong your existence. My friend, pleasure was my dearest possession. I revered her all her life. I wanted to expire in her arms, and my end is near. Six women more beautiful than the day are in the next room. I'm keeping them for this moment. Take your share of them, follow my example. Try not to forget that in their bosom, all the various sophistry of superstition and all the idiotic errors of hypocrisy. The dying man rings the bell. The woman entered the room. The preacher became in their arms. The man corrupted my nature, but he hadn't been able to explain what corrupt nature was. So, like I said, at the starting, the priest was a virtuous man, but then later he became a sexually liberated libertine, which again, as I mentioned in fables, a person who's sexually what you say active, or who's greedy, or who's nasty, or who's not virtuous, learns through experience or from someone and becomes virtuous. The same thing Marquis de Sade is doing, but saying that the virtuous man, a heretic of nature, becomes corrupted and becomes a libertine, an evil libertine, but is purified and follows nature. And that's what happens to the priest at the end. The dying man tells him, that you should avoid all of these virtues, take pleasure. And he explains in that line, pleasure was my greatest possession, and that through indulging in our pleasures, we prolong our life, we live the greatest. And that's how and then he encourages the priest to go and satisfy his carnal desires. And that's how the dialogue ends. Well, this was the 6 or 5 important points I wanted to discuss in this video. And you might be wondering why I have Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche's picture while discussing Marquis de Sade. The reason being there were some issues while recording this video, but Nietzsche is a very important component. Marquis de Sade's work is still, even by today's standards, it's considered very radical and to large extent unacceptable. But I believe we should read it for what it is. We should read it from the perspective of the Marquis, and we should admire it and also be cautious while reading it. That's why I've taken the people who have admired his work, one of them being Nietzsche. Although not openly or outrightly have admired his work, if you read Nietzsche in philosophy, which is quite dominant in the modern world, you can see elements hinting towards the Marquis de Sade. And this person, if you might wonder, like the Marquis is a Frenchman, Charles Baudelaire, he wrote a book of poems known as Le Fleur de Mal, Flowers of Evil, which, like the Marquis's book, contains a lot of what you say sexually explicit poems, but is considered a great work of art even to this day. And he himself, for his artistic creativity, is indebted to the Marquis de Sade. And finally, the people who have actually credited the Marquis de Sade is the psychoanalytical society which Sigmund Freud belonged to. Sigmund Freud himself, openly and privately, admitted to his being influenced by the Marquis de Sade. And as we all know, Sigmund Freud was, as we know, depended, most of his psychology revolved around sexuality. And this makes sense because the Marquis de Sade's philosophy is basically a philosophy on sex, or more or less on sex. I wouldn't condense it completely to sex, but yeah, his philosophy and Sigmund Freud's work closely aligns, and Freud himself admitted to it. And there is an example also where I believe where you can find a close distinction, where you can find a close relation between Marquis de Sade's thoughts and Sigmund Freud's thoughts. In his book Philosophy in the Bedroom, the young girl Eugene admits to having loving her father and hating her mother. And the other protagonist, Madame de Saint Onge, she also admits of loving her father and hating her mother. This again ties to Sigmund Freud's Electra complex, which he claims that young girls often love their father or lust after their father and hate their mother for having that matriarchal position. So we can see in how many ways the Marquis de Sade has influenced not only philosophy or literature, but has also influenced the psychological mind of someone like Sigmund Freud. With this, I would like to conclude by saying that we should read this man's work for what it is, but we should also be cautious and careful while comprehending and understanding his words, because the Marquis de Sade will and forever remain the Marquis de Sade and will be the father of Citizen. In my next video, I will be talking about another French thinker, which I prefer to call the gangster philosopher Francois Delors. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing his name right. Francois de la Rochefoucauld. Okay, the gangster philosopher. Unlike the Marquis, he belonged to the aristocracy. But unlike the Marquis, he was a far more clever man to avoid prison and being one of the greatest adventurers of all times, and to being the most Nietzschean of all philosophers of the French Enlightenment. So stick around, join and subscribe, and wait for next week when I release my video on Francois de la Rochefoucauld. Thank you.